Their marketing machine is data-driven, it's very precise, it's extremely well-financed, and it's relentless. And they're designed to move the product, and they're designed to circumvent current obstacles. This is just the beginning. These are all new. It's a new wave of addiction that's occurring in our country, and we are largely, by self-appointment, powerless to do anything about it. Here's the story of the little cigars and cigarillos. One of the tactics to blunt the sale of cigarettes was say you can't sell them singly because children are particularly price sensitive. So they say you got to buy in a pack of 20. It's okay, so they invented a little cigar, which is really a cigarette in disguise. Cigars are not held to the same rules. So we could say, okay, the little things. You know, I often thought of how do you bring tobacco down? Some people want some sweeping legislation. It's not going to happen. And being from the South and being from Louisiana, I say, you know what, how about we use termites as a model? If we have millions of different activities around this country, they'll bring that house down faster than anything. That's where individual action occurs, and that's where some of the things we'll talk about. In Louisiana, the greatest success we've had are in some rural communities that have decided they've had enough. Monroe, Louisiana, has very aggressive anti-smoking laws. Alexandria, Louisiana, who would have thunk it, right? But basically, by taking a very positive view and about a very health-oriented view and saying, we're going to protect our kids, we're going to stop this. And that's what it's going to take, and that's what empowers you here, and that's what's so exciting about Delaware. I think they can do it. Here's some new things. These are new points of entry into the addiction machine. It's brilliant. Look at the key words here: pleasure, freshness, free, cost sensitivity. It gives you insight into what their marketing tactics are. And these are now nationally advertised in magazines where cigarettes could not be. So they found a way around it. This is a relentless foe that unless we take it to the heart of where it lives, we will lose. They're very focused, they're very well financed, and they play on our weaknesses. We need to do something about it. Another example looks like Tic Tacs. These are all new dissolvable tobacco, so you don't even have to spit. It's ironic that they showed the ear, nose, and throat physician basically endorsing cigarettes. You know, it's one of the most devastating diseases I've seen is head and neck cancers. Not a good way to go. And this is exactly what it's promoting. And they promote it in basically things that we're very familiar with. It looks like a Tic Tac. It looks like a breath strip. It looks like a toothpick. What could be more insidious? Now the hookah. It's the wave in colleges. I work overseas quite a bit now. It's sweeping the Middle East because it's a big social issue. And they play the old game about, look, it's filtered, knowing full well it doesn't filter, just like the filters in the tars before. They're not impeded by honesty. Let's look at some of the products. Virginia Slims, aimed specifically and effectively at women. You've come a long way, baby. Indeed. Now, for the first time, the deaths for heart disease, men and women are equal, thanks to cigarettes. Camel Crush and Marlboro are really directed about a critical element in the addiction machine, menthol. Menthol is a dermatologist, I'll tell you, it's a counter-irritant, but functions like an anesthetic. And by the taste and by the anesthesia, it overcomes the body's natural resistance to inhaling and ingesting toxins and gets people used to the flavor, desensitized, and gets them addicted to the nicotine. It's people who say, oh, it's just a flavor. No, it's a part of this addiction machine, just like the candy flavors are. And these are the clues where we need to intervene. The latest, the electronic cigarette. Now, does anybody think that the big tobacco companies have bought these products to stop smoking? I don't think so. It's yet another entry into the addiction machine, and it's something that I think is going to be very difficult to block. It's a way around the clear air laws because it's a new product. And I must say that the government is pretty timid on this one because I've just recently learned that many in the FDA feel, look, it's a legal enterprise, and we have to not go so far as to dismantle a legal enterprise. I say it's a legal enterprise only because we didn't know better, because we were deceived, and I think we need to call that legal enterprise into question as people. Here they are again. Notice the friendly packaging and the flavoring. Once again, the old playbook about let's have the flavoring, let's aim at the kids, let's make it cool, let's make it tasty, and let's get them addicted. So this smoking intervention is part of our identity. And I want you to know, like, if you're going to be pioneers and really taking this on, Dr. Ochsner was ridiculed most of his career. And his mentors told him, you need to get off this or it's going to damage your future. Nobody believed it. And the story that his son, who was a renowned cardiovascular surgeon himself, would tell me, he said, you know, Daddy, when he was a young man in medical school abroad, the deaner, the one who does the dissection, called everyone over and said, look, this is a carcinoma of a lung. You may never see it again. Smoking changed that. And he had that in the back of his mind when he saw this. And Michael DeBakey was one of his first residents, and they both went on to do good things for people in medicine. So he was on a jihad, and just as a fun fact for you, he was on the board of a national airlines, and he was able to force them in order, he said, look, I'll be on your board if you'll do one thing. I want non-smoking seats on your airline. The first non-smoking seats in America because of Alton Ochsner, 3 seats. And he wanted them to stop giving out free cigarettes on the way in. They wouldn't do that, but he said, let's compromise. We'll only give them if people ask. That's how far we've come, but that's how slow we've gone. 75 years later, we're still struggling, and they're on a counterattack. And I don't think we can afford to lose this one. So here's another one from the playbook, Perfectly Safe. The filter was promoted as a safe way to smoke. It was a lie and they knew it. And the same thing for the low tar. It was a lie and they knew it, but we bought it. And I think you'll see in the new way of doing things, Perfectly Safe is the same argument. They'll dust off the old playbook and it'll probably work again unless we stop it. I'll tell you that we don't know what's in those vapors. We do know that there's a wide variety in the concentration of the nicotine. We also know that in some cases we find fiberglass, we find formaldehyde. Last I heard, formaldehyde wasn't good to breathe. And we must, I think, we can get into a very fine debate about, gee, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I think personally, it's a way that people can continue their nicotine habit in public and continue to smoke in private, and can you send us the bill and kill people through passive smoke unintentionally? So let's talk about why it's a pediatric disease. I think it's important to know that it actually affects the brain. The developing brain is much more sensitive to this than the mature brain. It changes how we respond, it changes our receptors, and it can change the structure of the brain. It's a big deal. This is not just candy. In fact, it's something that is a powerful chemical that changes people. We also know it changes that addiction cycle can be very young, and it begins actually in utero with the mother that smokes. Secondhand smoke can also have can have effects on behavior. And the prenatal effects, I think, are devastating. We get much more energized about far fewer children being at risk and being injured and die than we do about the effects of the deaths from premature birth and the deaths associated with sudden infant death syndrome. About, number I understand is about 5,000 a year. In what other subject would we tolerate the deaths of 5,000 children? I can't think of one, yet we do. And then, of course, the episodes of asthma, the episodes of infection. Now, this is a long laundry list of the kind of things that we know, the cancers, the lung disease, the coronary disease, and in particular, when we have this obesity epidemic with diabetes and hypertension, how smoking really accelerates the destructive property of those diseases. It's not just these three things operating independently, it's how they work together to disable our population. And remember, the top 5% are half of our cost, and we're allowing this group that will migrate into that 5% to get much larger, much faster. So there's been this interesting connection between nicotine and childhood obesity that I didn't know about, and that the idea is that there may be some connection between the mother smoking and later obesity in their satiety levels. But more importantly are these numbers, and this is the number personally that haunts me and energizes me, and I hope energizes you. There are 6 million children alive today who are going to die from smoking. And the only thing that prevents that from happening are the people in this room and the people in rooms like this around the country. 6 million kids' lives depend on our ability to act differently than we are today. 6,000 kids will die from tobacco exposure as children, and there are 5.4 million childhood illnesses caused by smoking. Here's some numbers. It's about how do you recharge this addiction machine, how do you prime the pump again to keep it going. About 1.5 million children younger than 18 start smoking. About 23% of high school kids, our future smokers, are smoking. 8% start in middle school. 3,200 kids younger than 18 smoke their first cigarette every day. And each day, 2,100 children and young adults start smoking on a daily basis. What we're doing isn't working. And what's coming down the pike will make it even worse. And my question again is, so what are we going to do about this? Are we going to tackle it? Are we going to solve it? Or are we going to accept it and not like the consequences? This is a measure, there was a study about the conatine of blood levels that was done on a sample of people that were admitted to the hospital. And the point is that passive smoke does give people a heavy dose, and in particular children. And it's not a mystery. You're in the house with an adult. I remember this, I've got this image. I was in one of our rural clinics, and I saw a mom. She's pregnant. She has one kid in her hand, on her arm, and another kid here, and she's smoking. You know, how can you poison 4 people at once? That's how. And in the face of that, we're pretty passive. Pretty passive. So here's the death toll, 480,000 Americans a year. 50,000 people a year die from passive smoke. I was thinking of that when they had 2 women who weren't smokers on Alton Oxford study, probably lived with a smoker, right? And when we talk about rights, I think my right to live exceeds someone else's right to smoke. And when you talk about oncogenes, I don't know what it takes to turn one on. I don't want to find out. And I don't think anybody should find out. So when we talk about what's fair, people have an innate sense of fairness, and we need to appeal to that. They do have a sense of fairness. And it's not fair to poison other people. And I heard the discussion around language we're going to talk about in a bit. We need to change our language. Because someone says it's fair for me to smoke, I don't think they'd say it's fair for me to poison and kill other people. That's blunt language that ties what you do to what happens. And that's where we need to change that. 16 million people suffer smoke-related illnesses, and you see the number that is just staggering, but more information isn't going to solve this problem. We know this, but we disregard it. Smoking kills more people than alcohol, AIDS, car accidents, illegal drugs, murders, and suicides combined, with thousands more dying from the kind of tobacco you put in your mouth. Of all the kids who became new smokers each year, almost a third will ultimately die from it. In addition, smokers lose an average 13 to 14 years of life. That's the productivity and the health and the illness part. And each cigarette takes about 7 minutes of your life. If we propose this today, you would either be laughed out of the room or thrown out of the room. But because it's today and it started then, we do relatively nothing. So here's the cost for the libertarians. I've tried to have this conversation about, it's my right and all that. I don't think it's your right to send the bill to me. And it's kind of startling to know that for every pack of cigarettes sold, it generates $10 in cost to the society. $10. When you see that cash register rolling, it's huge. So as a start, we could say, listen, at least make it cost neutral. Add $10 in taxes to the cost. And by the way, we're going to say that you're not supposed to smoke, but we're going to help you. So in Louisiana, we had something unique happen. It's the only case in the history of the United States where someone took tobacco to court as an individual and took it all the way to the Supreme Court and won a judgment for $280 million in compensation for what they called the racketeering, the lies, and deception that occurred. And it is devoted entirely to cessation. So in our state, if you're in the middle of what's called the Scott class, meaning you were 35 or older, that you can have all of your treatments and your visits paid for the next 10 years. But I would say that we could have a Scott class in every state if we chose to use the tobacco settlement money for the purposes it was intended. For the purposes it was intended. So we'll work on the cessation part, but we're not going to get mixed up that's going to solve it. We're going to get rid of the pediatric part. 1, to protect the children, and 2, nobody's a better change agent than a child, right? So how do we change this? $10 a pack. So here's some of the numbers. It's basically a $300 billion problem. I think that's the latest. So in an era where we can't afford to take care of people in the way that makes us ashamed that we don't, how about $300 billion as a starter? I think we can do this. So anytime someone wants to talk about the health care, I'd say, so what are you doing to take care of smoking? I have a $300 billion solution. Do you? Never mind the pain and the suffering. Never mind the embarrassment that it's rooted in childhood and we won't protect our children. So here's some numbers that I got for Delaware. It may not be correct, but this is the best I could do. Lose about 1,300 a year to smoking. About 17,000 kids in the state who are alive will die from smoking today. They're depending on you to do something. About a little over 18% of high school kids smoke. Daily smokers about 700. Packs of cigarettes, 2.3 million to kids. I don't think it's working very well. Annual health toll cost about $500 million. This $4.98 billion is the national figure for passive smoke. I didn't have one for the state. And just more numbers, more of the same. The question is that we don't need more information. The question what are we going to do about it. So what can be done? Where's a laundry list of things where I can get started? We can talk about that. I think, though, ultimately it's going to require a grassroots movement. It's going to require a number of people who say, listen, we're done with this. And if you look at grassroots movements in this country, in this world, are happening faster and faster because of the information age, social media, that we need to decide that this part of the healthcare dilemma and gridlock we can take care of because we love our kids. And I would say that if I had 3 principles that I really like to promote for this grassroots movement, it's first of all, let's set a date certain when we're going to have no children smoking. If you don't have the proper goal, it'll never work. And if you don't have a date, you know what it is with people who manage projects. A goal without a deadline is called a dream, and I think our children deserve more than a dream. So we need to have a date certain. We need to make very clear that smokers aren't the enemy. They love their kids too. They don't want to hurt people, but they're addicted. And we know fully that about 70% wish they could quit, want to quit, half try every year, and it's a tough thing to quit. And it's not, and the effect is different in different people. So some populations are particularly vulnerable because the nicotine helps them. We need to understand that. This isn't good guys and bad guys. It's what's the problem and how we help them solve it. How we all work together to protect our children. And the third part is let's be civil, because we need to come together to do something that's great for people and particularly great for our children. If we do that, I think we have the makings of a real movement. But some of these things we can do, and you can tell by how tobacco fights tooth and nail against them. Children are very price sensitive. So let's make it very expensive to buy cigarettes. And let's give those who smoke a very strong reason to stop. Now people say, it's interesting, even with clinicians who say, listen, and we had this discussion, it's really not fair because, what about these people who are addicted? And I say, yeah, what about them? You're right. We need to at the same time give a helping hand, but remember this, there are more former smokers in this country than smokers. You can stop. You just need a powerful reason to quit. That's the activation part, the readiness part, and then you need a method to help you stop. So we can do that. That's something I think all healthcare organizations should take on, and that's something government should use its funds to do because it's the right thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do economically and health-wise. We need to create other issues or other obstacles for cost. Sell them many cigars. If we can't beat that, you got to sell them in 20. So you can't sell them one and really appeal to that cost sensitivity of children. Tax loose tobacco the same as you do cigarettes, because right now it's basically taxed less, and it's another avenue where people can start smoking. Create more obstacles. We know that the more difficult it is to smoke, the fewer people smoke. Simple as that. So people say, oh, they can get around it. Not as many will. And our job is to save one life at a time, one group at a time, make it hard, and fewer people will smoke. So what works? What did the tobacco industry really push? Put it behind the counter, get it out of mind. I walked into Walgreens just the other day to tell them that was my last day at Walgreens, I'm going to CVS. There behind the counter was a wall full of cigarettes, including one, sale, $3.83 a pack. Let's make it easy for people to smoke. Let's make it easy for kids to smoke. So put it behind the counter. They love branding. You've seen all the slick packaging. Make it brown like they do in other parts of the world. Take the glamour out of it. And we cannot label the kinds of things that they do in other countries, like in Brazil and Australia. They put the gruesome pictures on and say, this is going to happen to you if you do that. We can't do that in this country as of a recent federal ruling. But there's nothing to say you can't put it in a counter that puts it on that. There's nothing that couldn't say, for example, you're going to put it in a case, you want to buy it here, let me open up, and by the way, here's the story. So we're smart people. We're smarter than they are. The question is, are we motivated more than they are? We can find lots of ways to tell the truth. Utilize behavior models. That's what we've done. That's what these small cities in Louisiana have done. Have a positive message. It's about a long, healthy life. It's about all the things that we're going to do to be healthy, rather than taking something away from people, which is usually, you know, we're very loss resistant as people. Let's give people something. And that's where government and industry, employers, and groups can come. Look, what does it take to incentivize you? And what does it take to de-incentivize you? And that's what we do in our place. We give very steep discounts if you, in fact, engage in multiple healthy activities, including smoking cessation. I think a family of four, we save about $3,000 on your insurance because we're self-pay, right? Self-insured probably as you are. We have power to manipulate this in a positive way to counter the manipulation that occurs with our population in a very negative way, and we need to use it. Policy. I love policy. That's why we created this institute, to talk about these burning questions that are not discussed. But remember, it has to end up in action that change people's behaviors. So we can talk about the dangers of secondhand smoking, and I think that no one should have to breathe secondhand smoke ever. So why don't we ban it in any public place, especially the streets, especially the parks, especially the playgrounds, because it's deadly. Do you need 50,000 dead people to make the case? Imagine if we had a room with those people and their families and say, no, you know, we just think it'd be kind of awkward to do that. They died needlessly because of our inactivity. And then finally, resist the efforts to make smokers a protected class. I checked, Delaware is not a protected class, so government is silent on that issue. At least they're not in the way. In other states, they're in the way. So when we started our smoking cessation plan, I could not say you had to be a non-smoker to be leading that program, because that's illegal. It's a labor practice that's prohibited. So government should at least get out of the way, and I think government could do a lot more as the largest employer and as the bully pulpit, and is setting the tone, and is telling the public the path we're on by default because we wouldn't talk about it, and the path we should be on to save our kids and our country's future. So let's create a grassroots movement, and let's change our language. I think if we talked about tobacco being poison, it would be a different discussion. If we were blunt talk about the way our children are being stalked, it would be a different discussion. If on that little cart that you had to put out and say, no, here are all the toxins you're going to be inhaling, and not only that, the ones closest to you, like your children who can't get out of the room will be inhaling, that we need to talk about. So we need to reframe the issue. And I think it needs to start with this very firm conviction, starting out, you're going to leave our kids alone. We have an industry that preys on children and preys on them very effectively and very actively. They know exactly how to manipulate people, and they're winning. And they're winning only because we choose not to oppose them with the same vigor that they pursue our children. And I ask you to join with me to create something that will at the very least protect our kids from exploitation and ultimately death. The lives of 6 million kids depend on our action today and tomorrow. And that's the kind of discussion I think we need to be having when we talk about real health care, putting the health back in health care. Thank you.
About passion and dedication, I think it may have come through. And we do have a few minutes for questions and comments with Dr. Quinlan. So if anyone has a question or comment, thought?
Thanks so much. That was really a wonderful talk. I just want to second everything you said, and I want to frame it as simply as possible. Cigarette smoking and tobacco consumption as a risk factor for disability and early death is in a class by itself. There isn't anything that comes close to this. And this is something that we can address and we can address as a society. I want to talk about the importance of advocacy in this, because we need advocacy organizations that can stand up to big tobacco. And the big three in this country, the American Heart Association, the American Lung Association, the American Cancer Society. But the resources available to them to counter tobacco is minuscule compared to what the tobacco industry has. What our professional societies have is they have the right on their side. And We, through all of our various organizations, where we work and where we pray and everything else we do, we need to get behind organizations that are really prepared to counter big tobacco and counter this in a big way. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for mentioning that, because I was startled when I first got into this to say, well, first it's the American Lung Association, the Cancer Association, the Heart Association, they'll get behind this. And what I wanted to repeal was this protective language for smokers in the state of Louisiana, which was fostered by the tobacco industry. And the response was, you know, we feel that's a little too strong. That isn't what we want to do. That's really overbearing. And they wouldn't engage with us. So I could understand that if we were talking about something that was marginal or in doubt, but we're talking about death and disability, and we're talking about actively stalking people, and if you don't match that, you lose, you just lose. And that's when I stopped contributing, because I said, if you're not going to take on the real issue, I don't want to work on the margins, and that's part of the strategy, is having people distracted, thinking by doing these little things, you're doing something. I'd rather they stopped if they're not going to take on the major things. Because we can make a bigger difference doing that than anything else we could do. Anything else. Thank you.
If you're looking for an opportunity to become an advocate about this issue, may I suggest that this evening you send an email or a telephone call to your state senator, because the second thing on the agenda tomorrow is a bill that will protect our children under the age of 18 from being able to buy electronic cigarettes. So please, take the time tonight to send an email or a telephone call to your state senator and tell them that you support protecting our children from electronic cigarettes.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Where do you think our research priorities should be in terms of creating a research agenda to combat secondhand smoke and primary smoking?
That's a great question, and I'm not a researcher, and I wouldn't presume. But there was a question that was kind of interesting that I thought earlier in the morning. Someone said, what's my role as a citizen, more or less, and my role as a researcher? And I think they're certainly not incompatible. That I think once we have enough information to know that we need to do something civically, because the answer is civic action, given the magnitude of the problem. And I've often thought that, you know, there's this, in law, if you have a swimming pool, it's called an attractive nuisance for children, right? And it's almost like being engaged in something little is an attractive nuisance. Because we should say is, this is important, I'm going to keep up my work, because this body of knowledge develops a momentum of its own and gives us insight. But don't confuse that with really tackling the problem head on in the way that this is being actively promoted. Get involved and say, listen, you know, I remember that, what was that movie where the guy leans out of the window and said, I'm not going to take it anymore, was it Network, yeah. And I guarantee you, if a few 100 million people hit the streets with torches and pitchforks, it'd be over tomorrow. Wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? But we don't. That's what we need to do. You think about suffrage, civil rights, safe cars, Ralph Nader, kook, until now it's like, of course I want a safe car. And the environment, it's faster and faster. And how do we use social media? I have this mental image that I wish I could afford to do this, is get on YouTube and talk about this, in the background having buses go by. And say, how many buses does it take to transport 6 million children to their death? And show those buses one after another, and then pan out. I calculated once how long that is, how many miles it is. It's huge. It's unbelievable. And they're on their way to death because we haven't done something. So that's the kind of thing we need to do. We need to be smart. We need to be piecemeal. We need to know on this. But we also need to get a sense of outrage about this, much like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, much like women and churches came together to deal with prohibition. Now, granted, it was repealed, but the amount of alcohol that was consumed before and after prohibition was vastly different, right? And that's the kind of thing we need to do. Personally, I think Mothers Against Drunk Driving is a really good one. That's what we're talking about in pediatrics. I would like every expectant mother and every parent who has children to say, I know you're worried about porn, violence, guns, and all that, but let me tell you, unlike all of those, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's stalking your kid right now, and it's going to get 1 out of 5. And first it's going to addict them, then it's going to take their money, then it's going to take their health, and finally it's going to take their lives. And are you going to stand by and let them do that? Are we going to worry about nuances? Gee, I don't know. No, just say, stop that. If there's a shooter out there, you don't say, I need more bulletproof stuff. You say, go get the shooter. We need to get the industry that's stalking our children and stop it.